I wanted to offer you a brief introduction to the material in Chapter 2 of your text. The goal of this chapter is really to get you to put aside your preconceived ideas about social problems and to adopt the social constructionist approach. To really understand what constructionism is all about, you have to understand that constructionists are not concerned with whether or not a social problem actually is real. Instead, they focus on how problems are defined and what factors influence whether those definitions become widespread and serve to motivate action to change conditions. Constructionists ask about the types of arguments claims makers put forward, how persuasive they are in motivating public opinion. The whole idea here is that if you can change opinion, people will take action and conditions will change. When we start to talk about arguments and persuasion, we're talking essentially about rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of convincing others. The study of rhetoric was formalized by the ancient Greeks, in particular Aristotle, who established its three key ingredients. Those are ethos, pathos, and logos. In this chapter, we'll be mainly concerned with logos, the art of establishing the facts about a situation, and to some extent, pathos, the art of engendering emotion in an audience, the art of engendering emotion about the condition, I should say, in the audience. We'll spend time on ethos in a few weeks, so don't worry, we'll have that covered as well. Switching to the language of constructionism, our concern will be with the three central components of every social problem's claim: grounds, warrants, and conclusions. Grounds are the easiest to grasp. They simply are the facts that are used to establish a condition is real. These facts can come from many places. The facts first describes are typifying examples. Others use the term typifications. I actually prefer that term myself. At any rate, a typifying example often consists of a startling or particularly horrifying story that's used to call attention to a problem. Such stories are usually true, but they're not necessarily typical. Best used is the example of a story told about a very young child who was beaten to death by his parents. While certainly horrific, very few children in fact die as a result of abuse. This is not to minimize concern about child abuse. Rather, Best wants to point out the rhetorical strategies that claims makers employ to get attention and cultivate sympathy, both of which they hope will lead people to take action. Here's another example. Between September 2019 and March 2020, huge swaths of the forest in eastern Australia were devastated by bushfires. The fires killed more than 34 people and destroyed more than 2,500 homes. It was estimated that over 3 billion animals were killed in the fires. I spent some time searching for an image depicting the effect on animals, and I have to tell you that some of the ones that I found were too awful to share with you. This one here is one of the less troubling pictures. Okay, now stop and think about it for a minute. The kangaroo is an animal about which most people have positive associations. Think of all the cute pictures you've seen of baby kangaroos in their mother's pouches, or of kangaroos hopping across an open grassland. If any animal represents freedom and joy, it's probably going to be the kangaroo. And now this. Then there's the koala bear. The koala bear is the archetypical teddy bear. It seems to me that every teddy bear I've ever seen is modeled on a koala bear. Did you have a koala bear teddy bear when you were little? I'm willing to bet that this image elicits sympathy and concern in you. So images like these flooded the Australian news reports during and after this period of fires, and along with them, a concern about human-induced climate change. This led to protests and increased criticism of the conservative government, which really did not have a very, shall we say, progressive climate policy. The thing is here is that bushfires are endemic to Australia and have been for millions of years. While the extent and severity of the 2019-2020 fires was probably exacerbated by climate change, it's probably a reach to say, I should say it's definitely a reach to say, that they were caused by climate change. But this didn't stop claims makers concerned with climate change from using images like these to advance the issue. Grounds also sometimes use statistics. Suppose that our typification of child abuse, the one mentioned by Best a little bit earlier, was followed by a message stating that 678,000 children were abused last year. While few people would conclude that 678,000 children died from child abuse, the statistic presented alongside of the story about the death is sure to increase concern about the issue. But wait, there's more. This statistic itself is open to question. Another site that I looked at said that the number wasn't 678,000, but rather 656,000 cases. Another site reported 618,000 cases. I found one site, though, that found nearly 3.2 million reported incidents of child abuse or maltreatment. So numbers in our culture suggest a certain level of certainty about a condition. They suggest that the condition has been measured objectively. It very well may have been, but what exactly was measured? Well, it turns out that those 3.5 million reported incidents is an accurate figure. But of what? Read it carefully. First, you'll notice the word reported. Here, reported means incidents that were reported to the relevant Office of Child Protective Services for the city or county in which the incident occurred. In fact, of those reported incidents, only 656,000 were found to meet the definition of maltreatment. This was down, by the way, from 677,000 in the previous years, so it would seem that the situation is improving, at least somewhat. But more interesting here is the fact that 84% of the cases, that's 84 of this, what was it, 656,000 I think it was, 84% of those cases were limited to a single incident of maltreatment. So my guess here is that these cases are probably not the kinds that are going to lead to a child's death. Then we have to ask a second question: what exactly is maltreatment? Well, maltreatment consists, according to the definition put forward by the relevant authority, I think in this case it was the Administration for Children and Families, correct me if I'm wrong, maltreatment consists of neglect and physical abuse. Clearly, physical abuse was what was responsible for the death of the child that Best talks about. Yet in 2019, the year upon which these data are based, physical abuse made up only 11% of all child abuse incidents. Okay, so before you come to the conclusion that constructionists want to downplay something like child abuse, let me state for the record that they don't. What constructionists are interested in is the way in which claims makers present their case for a problem and those they seek to persuade, and how those they seek to persuade are likely to react to it. Very few members of the audience for claims about child abuse, for example, are likely to spend the half an hour or so that I did tracking down what the child abuse numbers are all about and how best to interpret them. This is always the case. But in putting forward a claim, claims makers have an incentive to use the most persuasive yet credible statistics that they can find in order to make their case. Rest assured that we're going to spend more time on this question of statistics later in the term. Okay, before we move on, I just want to share two maps depicting the bushfires in Australia that I mentioned just a few minutes ago. Both were criticized as highly misleading. The first one was made to look like a photograph taken from space. It is in fact an illustration that showed outbreaks of fire over the course of an entire month. The image makes it appear, though, as if large parts of Australia were all on fire at the same time. This was not the case. The second image was created for U.S. audience, and people in Perth, which is located about here, called in to ask whether they should be worried that their homes were on fire, while in fact the fires never reached that part of the Australian continent. I'm not going to cover them here, but make sure that you pay attention to what Best calls additional grounds. These are things like describing a condition as representing a worsening situation, the characterization that the problem is a familiar one, what claims makers say about the people that are involved or that might be affected by the condition. Are they seen as victims? Are they seen as survivors? Does the story include villains, and what kinds of villains? Corporations, liberals, conservatives, the capitalist system. We have any one of a range of a number of different kinds of villains, and a good story will always have a bad guy, right? Let's conclude with a brief discussion of warrants. Warrants are said to be the reasons that we should become concerned with a social condition. Even if claims makers convince audiences that a condition is real, in order to activate concern, they need to link that condition to some value. Claims makers, in other words, need to show that some value or belief is threatened by the condition. As Best puts it, warrants are what are brought forward to justify action. They argue that the condition, again, is inconsistent with what we value, and therefore action is required to address it. In the United States, for example, values may include such things as freedom, justice, protection of the vulnerable, protection of the innocent, equality, things like that. Other societies perhaps have values that would include religious beliefs. A condition is wrong because it violates the rules laid down in a holy book. Other cultures are characterized by valuing ancestors and family. So a condition might be said to threaten those values. By the way, that's not to say here that these aren't important in American society. They are. But I think the ones that I mentioned earlier are probably the most important. And lately, it seems as if freedom is a particularly strong American value that claims makers attempt to attach their conditions to. Something Best doesn't mention here is the belief in the importance of economic efficiency. Well, he actually does mention it, but he doesn't name it that way. Here we're talking about the idea of cost. Claims makers sometimes make the argument that problematic conditions are costly. Declining school achievement, for example, not only represents a moral failure to educate our children, but it's also said to lead to a decline in worker productivity, which over the long run will lower standards of living. Claims about the high costs of mass incarceration provide another example. While some audiences will respond to warrants about the morality of imprisoning 2.2 million Americans, others will be swayed by the $81 billion spent on prison, parole, and probation. Another example, claims about the legalization of cannabis take a similar form. For a general audience, warrants about legalization are often founded on the American value of personal freedom. Government officials, however, may be more interested in the potential tax revenue that may accrue from cannabis sales. Okay, so to sum it all up, what the second chapter of the text argues is that claims makers need to marshal compelling evidence to establish the realities of their claims and have a sufficient understanding of the audiences they seek to influence in order to create relevant warrants. Sometimes claims makers will segment their audiences and deliver different grounds and different warrants depending on their assessment of their effectiveness with different groups. This was made clear in our example of the two types of warrants used for prison reform and marijuana legalization. Sometimes they recognize, at the same time, that certain audiences will not be persuaded, no matter how claims are framed. Best offers the abortion debate here as an example. In this case, claims makers focus on strengthening the beliefs of the audience that they already have captured. Other times, claims makers can develop warrants that create alliances between groups with very different ideological commitments. And he gives you some examples here about school uniforms and education reform more generally. Just remember that the material in this chapter is basic to what we're going to cover in the rest of the course. It's also critical to the analysis that you're doing of your social problem. I think I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that you found this discussion useful.